It is quite clear that the activity of even such insignificant organs as the salivary glands penetrates unconsciously into our everyday psychical conditions through sensations, desires, and thoughts, which in turn exert an influence on the work of the glands themselves. We see no reason why the same should not apply to the other organs of the body. It is indeed by means of such unconscious impressions that the usual physiological processes of our bodies are guided. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, the man who spoke these words, is linked indissolubly with this city, once St. Petersburg, now Leningrad. Here he studied, lived, and worked. Just as Darwin had rocked man's vision of a fixed biological order, so 50 years later, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was to change man's conception of himself, his behavior, and his learning processes. Now Pavlov's apartment is a museum. Everything has remained in place as it was. The things speak about the characteristics of their owner, a simple, punctual, kind, and stubborn man. But these things cannot tell you about his devotion to science, his experimental research. There is a great deal that the things cannot speak about. A bear skin. Pavlov never went hunting for bears. This was a present. A piano on which he never played, others played. Pavlov loved to listen. Here are his books, literature, science, philosophy. They will tell you a great deal, but a man's work defines him best. A colleague recalls, days would go on until 9 o'clock in the evening. Then I would climb the stairs, would ring, and Ivan Petrovich himself would open the door. He had already had a chance to rest. Ivan Petrovich followed a rigid, measured ritual. He would sit down to drink some tea, he'd invite a visitor to join him, and sometimes, while they were drinking tea, conversations would begin on themes which would of interest to him. Pavlov's father, Peter Dmitrovich, a priest, lived in the ancient city of Ryazan on the Oka River in the very center of Russia. And it was here on September the 14th, 1849, that his eldest son was born, Ivan Vanya, in a house among apple orchards which his father had grown. Children must continue what their fathers have begun. Following this rule, Peter Dmitrovich sent his son to a church school. Ivan studied well, but he didn't always get good grades in deportment. After the church school, a theological seminary. One could count the months remaining until the completion of his studies. But in the garret of the future priest, there appeared books of a non-ecclesiastical nature. A drawing of the digestive system in George Henry Lewis' Physiology of Common Life decided Pavlov's fate. How did this complicated system work? Young Pavlov had to find out. The priest-to-be left the seminary and went off to the capital city of St. Petersburg. In 1870, Pavlov took his first steps in science at the University of St. Petersburg. Here he was awarded a gold medal for his work with Ilya Sion, the professor of physiology. From the university, Pavlov entered the Military Medical Academy in order to become not merely a physiologist, but a good surgeon experimenter as well. The well-known therapeutist Botkin and the physiologist Sechenov became his teachers. Botkin invited the able student to his clinic. In a small laboratory in this clinic, Ivan Petrovich created his first scientific work, Centrifugal Cardiac Nerves, about the influence of one of the nerves on the work of the cardiac muscles. This was a new idea in physiology. For this dissertation, Pavlov was awarded the degree of Doctor of Medicine. While at the medical academy, the young scholar also perfected his skill as a surgeon in the operating room. He astonished the faculty and students with the brilliance of his experiments. Can I see it? Can I measure it? Can I repeat my results? These three criteria guided Pavlov's first great investigation into the working of the digestive tract. In the Institute of Experimental Medicine, Pavlov devised a method of operating which allows one to follow the process of digestion firsthand in the living organism, while at the same time not causing injury to the nerve connections. Now scholars could explain the chemical nature of the processes taking place in the stomach of an animal and that of man. For this work, Ivan Petrovich was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1904. He was invited to give lectures in universities throughout the world. Scholars from many countries flocked to see him. Pavlov's honors became too numerous to count. Pavlov could tolerate fame so long as it did not interfere with his time in the laboratory. In 1912, Pavlov was invited to England for the presentation to him of the degree of Doctor of Cambridge University. The speeches of welcome resounded in classical Latin. A solemn ceremony, which had been sanctified by the centuries, took place. And when it had come to an end, directly from the gallery, a salivating little dog with test tubes hanging from it fell into the hands of Pavlov. Among the students responsible for the prank was the grandson of Darwin. Both animals and man are born with the ability, from birth, to swallow food, to breathe. Pavlov called these abilities unconditioned reflexes. But under the influence of the surrounding environment, reflexes, which Pavlov called conditioned reflexes, appeared in the animal. When the dog sees food, its mouth, as we say, waters. But if a light is constantly switched on just before the dog is fed, after a while the switching on of the light will evoke salivation, although there is no food at the same time. Pavlov proved that a temporary connection is formed in the brain of the dog, a connection between the light and being fed. A conditioned reflex had appeared. It could be generated by sounds, by light, by any signals. And during salivation, it was possible to trace the reflex processes through the quantity of saliva. Imagine how the brain analyzes and gets to know all its surroundings. The brain became the object of Pavlov's studies, the psychic activity of man and animals. The second decade of the 20th century, the First World War, famine and devastation reigned in Russia, and her people struggled against conditions of barbarous poverty and lawlessness. The revolution had begun in Russia. The old scholar found in himself the strength to work in a frozen laboratory. The Soviet government, appreciating the importance of Pavlov's research, resolved to provide him and his colleagues with everything necessary for work and life. He came to the conclusion that, apart from a condition of stimulation, excitement, agitation, when conditioned reflexes are generated, A reverse process also takes place in the nervous system, an inhibition for non-reinforced stimuli, so that sounds and light would not interfere with the experiments. Special soundproof chambers were created. The facts which were amassed permitted Pavlov to begin formulating doctrines about types of nervous activities. Ivan Petrovich was now over 75, but his age only intensified his research. His time now was totally absorbed by his study of the functions of higher nervous centers in the brain. He continued to operate, observe, and correspond with scholars from all over the world. By agreement with the government, a new scientific center was built for Pavlov not far from Leningrad, in the village of Koltushi. Here he could work and rest. The scholar was over 85 years old. As before, he dressed modestly, he limped, but he was extraordinarily active and energetic. He would come to the laboratory every morning. Ivan Petrovich loved, as he used to say, to think aloud. In this way, the time he would spend in the lab would elapse. On Wednesdays, the days of his consultations, he would come into contact with his colleagues or with an entire group. And he would begin to ponder over the experiments which had been set up, or over various questions of the physiology of higher nervous activity. He was accustomed to airing his ideas out loud, listening to objections, stirring up a discussion or arguments. He needed someone to talk to. And there always was someone to talk to. Someone who wouldn't always agree with everything that Ivan Petrovich said. Ivan Petrovich's need of meditating aloud, of having an audience to agree or not to agree, or to raise objections, this was typical of Ivan Petrovich Pavlov's power of creative activity. Pavlov himself said, our physiology, I mean not only my, but my numerous colleagues as well, physiology, is a new and particular physiology, that of the brain, the physiology of higher nervous activity, as we call it. One must say that it is not being accepted particularly easily. It is not coming into fashion particularly easily. It is gaining for itself citizens' rights in science and in the minds of educated people with great difficulty and very gradually. However, we ourselves, the ones who have been studying it for several decades, every day are convinced that we are standing on the true path and that some important use will come out of all this. This conviction ripened, especially at the time when our studies on animals were applied to the pathology of the nervous system and to medical treatment. Thus, before us looms our ever-increasing power over phenomena of the nerves. It is understandable, of course, that we have always wanted to connect these laboratory achievements of ours with human needs. So, I'm now visiting a nerve clinic and a psychiatric clinic. Laboratory work yielded a remarkable result. In the clinic, therapeutic sleep became one of the methods of treating psychic diseases. This method was based on the theory of conditioned reflexes. The prolonged rest of the nerve centers during sleep permits the patient's brain to rest and to renew the functions which were thought to be lost. In our days, in this clinic bearing the name of Pavlov, research on the work of the brain continues. The very newest apparatus enables one to obtain even more refined data for the study of reflex activity. In the clinic, not only sick people are examined, but those who are completely healthy. New methods of treating the mentally ill on Pavlovian principles are analyzed, compared, and adopted. In this room, the great Russian physiologist academician Ivan Petrovich Pavlov held clinic conferences, Wednesdays, from 1931 through 1936. Pavlov credited his own good health to energy and curiosity. He was a connoisseur of painting. He collected stamps. He had an herbarium. He loved music. His library numbered in the many hundreds of volumes. Despite his age, Ivan Petrovich was as indefatigable and ardent as a youth. In the summer, he would go swimming in any weather. He planted flowers, raked the paths. He still played gorodki, skittles, an ancient Russian game he had loved since childhood. He would play heatedly, sparing neither himself nor his partners. At the time, he was 84. Koltushi was not called the capital of the conditioned reflex for nothing. Foreign scholars kept coming in droves. The English writer H.G. Wells was one of Ivan Pavlov's guests. He is the one who said, "In 100 years, Pavlov's work will be appreciated even more than during his lifetime." This prediction of the writer and visionary is already coming true now. Pondering over the differences between humans and animals, Pavlov concluded that for human higher nervous activity, signals of a particular type have the major significance. Signals which are connected with man's vocal activity, with speech, with the production of the sounds of speech, as well as with the analysis and understanding of speech. Ivan Petrovich called this system of speech signals a secondary signal system, emphasizing that it constitutes a particular additional feature distinguishing human higher nervous activity from that of animals. The conditioned reflexes that Pavlov studied in animals make up a first signaling system. But because animals do not have speech, their intellectual activity is limited, as Pavlov said, by object thinking, by concrete thinking. The characteristic of human thinking is the ability not only to learn from experience, but especially to generalize concepts. The Academy of Sciences. The Pavlov Institute of Physiology today is a huge scientific establishment with hundreds of scientific workers. Written on the statue are Pavlov's words, "Let the dog, man's helpmate and friend since prehistoric times, sacrifice itself to science, but our virtue makes it incumbent upon us for this always to take place without unnecessary torment." The world's leading physiologists came to Leningrad for their 15th International Congress. Academician Pavlov was elected president. The Congress proclaimed Pavlov elder of the world's physiologists. He spoke. Our government is now giving extraordinarily large amounts of material support to scientific work, and it is attracting masses of our youth to science. And the worldwide contribution that youth makes to science should have a huge significance. Finally, in the third place, we are so happy right now, we are delighted that we are joined by your cordial greeting in our vital universal task. We are dear comrades, in many instances joined together by our obvious friendly feelings. We are evidently working for a rational and decisive union of our common interests. At the present, what is seen is an obvious, universal desire and aspiration for avoiding wars, and very likely with stronger means than up to now. And I am pleased that the government of my motherland has, for the first time, joined... Six months later, on February the 27th, 1936, Pavlov passed away. All of Leningrad buried him. A long human life had been lived out, a life totally devoted to science. Pavlov introduced new standards of objectivity in scientific experimentation. His study of conditioned reflexes has affected nearly every sphere of learning activity. His methods of creating experimental neuroses in animals have influenced the control of human mental illnesses. To youth dedicating themselves to science, I wish them consistency, first and foremost, wrote Pavlov. From the very start of your work, inculcate strict discipline in yourselves in the amassing of knowledge. Secondly, modesty, and thirdly, zeal. Remember that science demands of a man his entire life, and that if you had 2 lives, they wouldn't suffice. Be zealous in your quest.